when God tells you do it. We've got these miracles. It's called Miracles Around the Lake. And this lesson has, and these what they call sandwich story, one story that turns into another story. And the big sandwich story is the one with the Jairus' daughter and the woman that was bleeding, which we have this time.
In this lesson, that's the big sandwich. There's probably a bigger sandwich story, I think.
So we have the story.
In the Bible.
It's in Mark chapter 4, starting with verse 35. It's a familiar story to us. We've heard this. There's variations of the story depending on whether you're in Luke or Matthew. Matthew talks about, I've talked about this. Matthew was an accountant. He was the tax gatherer in Capernaum.
He was a number guy.
And he made sure that he had the numbers right. That's what he was concerned about. So in this story, when we get to the point of the demoniacs, Matthew records that there's two. Mark and Luke record that there's one. Why is there a discrepancy in there? Most likely, one of the guys was more prominent, and one of the guys did what God told him to do, and maybe the other guy was healed, but he didn't go and do what God told him to. And so Mark, which is Peter's account, and Luke, they concentrate on the one person and said the one. The other guy, who we don't know, and what happened to him, there may have been two guys that healed, like Matthew says, but only one followed what God did. So Mark, and most likely Luke, they recorded this guy. That guy, because evidently they knew who he was. We have the story here, and it's Jesus. It says that on the same day, when evening had come, he said to them, let's cross over to the other side. Now the Sea of Galilee, you could take 4 Sea of Galilees and stick them in surface area-wise, Lake Tahoe. It's a good-sized lake. It's 15 to 13 miles long and 8 miles wide. And that would be pretty good size, but it's not something that is so remote. When you're at South Lake Tahoe and you're looking up towards North Lake Tahoe, you can't see. There is some casinos up at North Lake Tahoe, but you can't see them because they're over the horizon on that bend of the earth there as you look at Lake Tahoe. The distance wasn't as great at the Sea of Galilee, and people could see quite a ways across, especially if it was going across 8 miles. You might, they didn't have binoculars and stuff, but they could see a lot was happening a good ways out. Jesus gets into the boat, and they go to the other side. Now, it's interesting that, let's see where it says here.
Well, one thing I'm going to point out is Jesus went to sleep. Now, he knew the storm was coming. He still went to sleep. Can you sleep when you know there's a storm coming? Depends on the storm.
No.
Can you sleep when there's a fire coming toward your house? Okay.
Anybody have Red Letter Edition Bible? And so when you're looking up the words of Jesus and you're looking up red, my Bible has quite a few pages where they messed up. And the words of Jesus are in black, and the other part, that's just the story part, is in red. So when you're looking up something, it gets very confusing. But in verse 36, it said there. Now this is a thing. Mark has interesting details that the other gospel writers don't have. He is taking Peter's account. And in verse 36 it says there was other little boats that were also with him. Matthew and Luke don't have that account in there. So not only was Jesus and the disciples going across, but there was other boats too. that were there during this whole thing. So it wasn't just the 12 disciples in the boat with Jesus having this thing. And what ended up happening, there was a windstorm came, and it said the waves beat into the boat. That means they're going over the side into the boat. And it was already filling. But Jesus was in the stern asleep on a pillow. And they awoke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Now this is fairly early in their ministry. They've been following, Jesus' ministry had, in the book of John, we find out that he had spent about a year in Judea. John is the only one that records that. Matthew and Mark and Luke, they start the ministry when Jesus is in Galilee. But they've been with Jesus for a bit, not full time. Jesus asked the disciples to become with him full time when he started his ministry in Galilee. That's when he called Peter and Andrew and James and John to full-time ministry. He called people then. Before that, they had been following him, but it was kind of like part-time. He had Peter and Andrew and John, most likely James, and Nathaniel and Philip. And he had those ones with him. Now he has 12 disciples, and they're following him. And they said, "Teacher, don't you care that we are perishing?" And he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And my thinking on this, especially when you have the account of Jonah, what did he say? "The storm is not going to go until you throw me into the sea." Remember that story? And they finally got to the point, and it's like, okay, there's nothing else we can do. And they took Jonah and threw him into the sea. And they had that storm that was crashing over the boat. They were thinking they were going to sink. My thought on that, it said immediately the storm ceased. We're not talking over 5 minutes. We're talking immediately. They threw him in, and the sea went flat. And I have a feeling when Jesus said, "Peace, be still,"
it went flat.
It ceased. It wasn't over 5-10 minutes where the wind, is the wind getting less? Oh, I think it might be. This was immediate. And they were saying, there's no doubt that God's working in both the story of Jonah, because the people were like flabbergasted. Who was that guy that we threw into the ocean?
And
who is this God of the Hebrews?
They started looking to God.
And here it's, what do they say? Who can this be that even the wind and the sea obey him? They're like, they've been following him. All of a sudden they see the power that he has over the wind and the waves. And immediately there's a calm. Now, who is this guy?
Now, one thing that was brought out in the group that we listened to was that some of these people in the area actually worship the wind. So when Jesus tells the wind to be still, and it does, we have a apparent human telling a God what to do, and the God obeys. That would be a stronger testimony to those who worship the wind, I would think. And understandably, because when you live by that sea, wind wasn't unusual. Wind was a common occurrence. And
especially when you take into account, we don't always think about this. Now, what's the lowest point in North America? It's what is it, Badwater, or it's in Death Valley. It's Badwater, I believe is the name of it, but it's pretty close, 280 feet below sea level or something like that, I think is what it is. And I might be wrong, don't quote me on that, because it could be 240 feet, I don't know, but I think 282 feet and 6 inches. No, don't quote me on that, I'm just kidding. But it's hot. The highest recorded temperature has been in Death Valley at that location, Badwater, and it's 282 feet below sea level. Do you know what the surface of Sea of Galilee is? Anybody know? It's 600 feet below sea level. Then it goes from the Jordan goes out of the Sea of Galilee and it goes about 75 miles down to the Dead Sea, but it takes about 150 miles of traveling because it's pretty crooked. When it goes into the Dead Sea, it's at 1,300 feet below sea level. And we don't always think about do you think it might be a little bit warm there? It's also prone, because there's hills around Galilee, that they get these intense windstorms. We can have some severe windstorms, especially between Milford and Doyle, as the wind comes down over the mountain and hits there, and many times it flips the trucks over. One time, it wasn't too long ago, it took out all of the power lines along that stretch of, there was like, I don't know, I think it was like about a mile of the power lines all went because of the wind. They had that same thing there with the wind, and it was severe. Now these fishermen, they're fishermen. Peter and Andrew, John and James, and probably a few of the others, they were used to being out on the Sea of Galilee, and they were terrified. This was something different. Ellen White talks about this, that at this time, it was one of the times that Satan was seeing if he could destroy Jesus, though Jesus wouldn't have his mission that he came for. They're trying to get rid of Jesus then. And the disciples were terrified.
Disciples, fishermen, on the sea all the time. They were accustomed to wind on the sea. This was different. They saw this as being way different and very dangerous.
But Jesus said, "Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?" And it said they feared exceedingly and said to one another, "Who can this be that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Now when they got to the other side, now we have another story going on. So we have the calming of the sea. We have the next story. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gadarenes. Gadarenes is also, you'll see different terms that will be called Decapolis. The Gerasenes, that's as one of the cities that was there, the Gadarenes. The 10 cities were Decapolis, 10 Decapolis. And they were somewhat pagan cities. That was an area that if you were a Roman soldier and you were retiring, the Roman government gave you land, and some of them got land in this area. And they were there was some Jews there, but they were pretty much pagan, Gentile region. And as they came here, it said, and he had come out of when they had come out of the boat, talk about Jesus, immediately they met him out of the tombs, a man with an unclean spirit, who had his dwelling among the tombs. No one could bind him, not even with chains, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been pulled apart by him, and the shackles broken to pieces. Neither could anyone tame him. And always, night and day, he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying out and cutting himself with stones. This guy was a pretty desperate person out here. He was living out there. You think about that. This story has a lot of uncleanliness in it. It's uncleanliness for you to be in the tombs. For Jews, that's uncleanliness. We have the story with the pigs. The pigs are what? Unclean. We have a lot of stuff going on all through this lesson. The woman bleeding made you what? Unclean.
And also, cutting yourself is forbidden in Leviticus.
So he was out there cutting himself with stones, and you can imagine this. And it talks about this area Or this guy, or in Matthew, it's two guys. People didn't want to go traveling around there. This is a notorious area, especially, you know, you wouldn't want to be out there at night with this guy shrieking and hollering and stuff. And Jesus lands there. Now the guy he wanted help. What's that?
It was planned that
Yeah.
Jesus would land there.
Jesus went there specifically. He went through the storm. He went through all of that to come and meet this guy here. And the guy seems to know it. And it says he runs and kneels at Jesus' feet. But as he tries to say something, who speaks for him? The demons. And he says, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High? I implore you, by God, that you do not torment me." For it says Jesus was telling the evil spirit, "Come out of him." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he answered, saying, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Now, how much is a legion? Does anybody know? 5,000 to 6,000 foot soldiers are in a legion. They have other people too with centurions and other stuff, but the foot soldiers, 5,000 to 6,000. Now, in the Good News Bible, it talks about, it doesn't say legion, it says a mob. Any way you look at it, there was a lot of demons in this guy. Legion, for we were many. And he begged him earnestly that he would not send him out of the country. And a large herd of swine was feeding near there. So the demons begged him, "Send us to the swine, and we may enter them." The demons had a plan. Satan has a plan.
Always.
And when you look at the Desire of Ages, it talks about this. And at once Jesus gave them permission to do what the demons wanted to do. Satan had a plan, but God had a bigger plan. And sometimes when we have stuff happen, we say, "Boy, that didn't work out good," till we see the rest of the story. The unclean spirits went out and entered the swine. There was about 2,000, and the herd ran violently down the steep place into the sea and drowned in the sea. And, now, you know how long, you think about this. Number one, 2,000 swine. We tried to figure this out on somebody who knew how much pigs cost. So usually I don't think any of us have been buying pigs, but that's probably around $500 in today's money.
We were
pig.
looking at that before the recent inflation, though.
So it's about if you put this in 2,000 times 500, ends up being about $1 million worth of pigs that go down and drown. And the swine herders, they saw all this. And evidently they saw the story going on before with this guy coming running. They see the boat come up and they said, "Are these guys crazy? Do they know who's here?" And the guys run up to him, demon possessed, and they're watching all this. And the guy is healed. But the spirits go into the swine, and the guys that they watch all the pigs go off and drowned in the sea.
Like lemmings.
The other issue going, now when those pigs go and drowned in the sea, is that the end of the pigs? They're going to be floating around there in the Sea of Galilee for quite a while. And they probably ended up, depending on which way the wind blow, you could have pigs going up onto the shore all over. This story went far and wide on there, you can imagine.
And we have fish eating the pigs.
And it says those who fed the swine, they fled. They went to the city and told all the country and told the people what had happened. And the people came out to see Jesus. Now they were looking at, Ellen White talks about, they were like, "Who is this guy? He destroyed our pigs. Now what's he going to do? Is he going to burn down our crops? destroy our vineyards, our orchards. We'll be in financial ruin. That's how they looked at this.
So first of all, they're wanting to get him out. Get
So
Jesus
they're afraid.
out of there.
It says they were afraid of Jesus, and when they got there, this devil-possessed guy who had been causing ruckus over the countryside is clothed and in his right mind. Before that, he had been naked running around as a crazy person, and you were not safe if you went in that area. Now, he's clothed and in his right mind, and he's sitting there at Jesus' feet, probably talking to Jesus, and Jesus is talking to him. There's a fair amount of time because the guys would have had to run into town. We don't know how far that was, maybe a few miles, come back again with all the people. So there was a little bit of time there. And the people were afraid. They were looking at financial ruin. And what ended up happening?
So they did the obvious. They said,
they
please
begged
leave.
him to get out of there.
Please get out of here.
Please turn around, get in your boat, and leave. We don't want you here. I don't know if they told him, we're afraid of you or whatever, but they said, leave.
Go.
And so
He did.
the person, as I mentioned, Mark and Luke mention one, Matthew mentions two, most likely because on this next part, this one guy did what Jesus told him to do. They wanted to go with him. At least this guy did. Please let me go with you. Wouldn't that be something you'd say, well, that would be a good thing to do. The guy needs, he needs some.
Additional training and teaching.
And what does Jesus tell him? And not only does he tell him, he tells us too. I think this applies to us.
He said, go home.
Go home to your friends and tell them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he has compassion on you. Does that fit us? Has God worked in our lives? Does he have compassion? We may not know all of the Bible truths and be able to explain it, but we can tell what God has done for us. And he asked each one of us, go home and tell what God has done for you. And that's what this guy did. Now, this isn't in the lesson, because I just looked through here real quick. I have a lesson supplemental thing, and they had that in there. And so I was thinking, well, did I miss that?
not
I didn't
in
see
there.
it in the quarterly. But Mark talks about, this guy went home. Now, the people who had driven Jesus out told him to get out of there. Jesus didn't leave in the boat, and they go back to Capernaum. And the guy goes home, tells what God has done for him. It made such a difference. It talks about that he probably traveled around the 10 cities in Decapolis, and he probably went and said, do you know what? Anybody know who I am? I was that crazy person that was over there on the shore of Galilee, and Jesus healed me from the demons. In Mark chapter 8, Jesus returns to the area. And what ends up happening? The people flock to see Jesus. It made such a change with this guy telling what God had done for him that the people end up coming and flocking to Jesus. They bring their sick to be healed. And they come and hear Jesus. We have the story on here of they run out of food. They've been with Jesus for 3 days. They run out of food. And Jesus feeds them with 7 loaves and 3 fish. I get 3 fish on there. The one in what I was reading here in Mark doesn't tell how many fish there were. I think it's 3 though. 7 loaves, 3 fish. And he feeds the people. It's 4,000 men plus women and children.
That's
This
a
was
lot. That's a
this
big
was
crowd
in
when you consider
Now
these
Jesus
are not
does something
believers.
similar. The stories are similar with the feeding of the 5,000, feeding of the 4,000, but they're not the same stories, and they have discrepancies in there. And Jesus asks them similar, tells the disciples, we need to get food for the people. And they're both. See, in the first one, it's the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus asked them,
How much food
how
do you
much
have?
food. And there's boy, if we had a year's wages, we couldn't buy enough food to feed 5,000 people, let alone women
Plus,
and children.
this is,
And Jesus asked how many they had. In the book of John, we find out that a boy had a lunch. A lad had a lunch. 5 loaves, 2 fish. These are not loaves of bread that are this big. Think of pita bread. That's the kind of bread that they had. Pita bread. Probably about yay big, looked like a pancake. So he had 5 pancakes and 2 fish. And the fish would not be big fish. Usually they were small fish. Small dried fish. And Jesus feeds the 5,000. Now, the disciples thinking about this, they said, we were Jews. That was Jewish people that were the feeding of the 5,000. Those are Jewish people. So certainly God could have done a miracle. But when they went a little bit later and were over and they had the feeding of the 4,000, the disciples figuring, no, those are Gentiles. God's not going to perform the same kind of miracle of feeding them. So they're like, no, I don't know where we're going to find the food for them. They're thinking that they're going to have to find the food because God can't perform a miracle for the Gentiles in their thinking. It's backward thinking, but that's what they thought.
but this needed to happen because they needed to see that
Is
God
the gospel
does.
just for the Jews? In their thinking, yep, that's it. Salvation is only for the Jews. But Jesus came to save all mankind.
Which is a good thing
And the
because
gospel was
most of
for
us
everyone.
wouldn't be there.
This isn't in the lesson, but I think
Most of us are
it's
not
important.
Jewish, not even a little bit.
Because Jesus fed. Now, the account, Mark, we look at it, and in the feeding of the 5,000, they had 12 baskets of food left over. The baskets, we look at it, and it says on the other one there was 7 baskets left over.
Different
And we
size
look
baskets.
at it, in our language, it says baskets, 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 baskets. So they all have to be the same kind of baskets, right?
Mm-mm.
The baskets that it's mentioned and the word that was taken and mentioned baskets in the feeding of the 5,000 would be the basket that you would have for taking your stuff for the day. We would think of maybe like a small backpack, a day pack. It would be that type of thing. It was a basket. It's a basket, but it was small. You'd have your lunch, maybe some food. Maybe you brought,
Swimsuit.
well, I don't know about swimsuit, but you probably had maybe
Well, if you think about a
maybe
picnic,
an extra cloak or something.
if you
that
go
you'd
tomorrow,
throw
you're
around.
going to take your swimsuit, I hope.
Yeah, if you're going tomorrow, that's what you need to do. Whereas in the description of basket that Mark uses, but is translated basket, and there's 7 baskets on the feeding of the 4,000 of food left over. Those were big baskets. It's the same term. Think about it this way. The term that is used in Acts when Saul, who later his name was changed to Paul, excuse me,
Are you talking about when they let him down over the edge with
and
the basket?
he was in
a basket?
Damascus, and they were watching the gates, and they were going to try and arrest him and kill him, get rid of Paul. And the people let Paul down in a basket. Now, would that be a little hamper basket, do you think? What do you have pictured? Kind of a big basket, right? If you were being let down in a basket over the wall with a rope, that basket would be kind of big. That's why, the term in here, English would be, we would look at it and say a small basket on the one, and it would say maybe a hamper on the other one. Think of that size, something that you'd take. Now, it's very interesting because we look at words that are translated and we don't get the meaning sometimes. I say this, in Bible translations. When you're translating the Bible into English from Aramaic, Greek, Hebrew, you're limited on what you can translate it. And some person will say, well, the word means, it could mean this, it could mean this, and it could mean this, and it could mean this. Which ones we pick? They all might be good words to use, but they may not give the whole meaning. We have, what do we call snow? Do we have any different terms that we call snow? Maybe corn snow, slush. We have a few terms, powder, but maybe snow that's all frozen in and it's icy. But we have very few terms that we use for snow. Dirty snow,
We
plain
talk
snow.
about powder when we're skiing, and there's also packed.
Eskimos have 40-something words that they use for snow. So if an Eskimo was talking about snow, you'd have to know, he might have one of 40 words that they're using in the description. We just have a few.
His description would be a lot more descriptive
This
and
is just
colorful.
an aside. I think it's very useful when we have different translations of the Bible that can use some of those different words, and we'd say, the King James, the New King James, these versions use this. What are some of the other versions what you might use? It's helpful. And it's very interesting to be able to get some of that views. Okay, I went on a way aside here.
Now. Let's go on. We're going to talk about on the roller coaster with Jesus. When did Jesus ride a roller coaster anyway? I don't remember a story about Jesus on the roller coaster. But in a way, his entire life was a roller coaster in that his whole life, they were trying to kill him. They were trying, they being Satan, from Herod to the Jews to who knows who else. I mean, Nazareth, the whole town wanted to take him out and throw him off the cliff. So here's something interesting. This ruler of the synagogue, is he one of the good guys or one of the bad guys? Ruler of the synagogue. Who did Jesus say bad things about? Scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. The ruler of the synagogue, kind of closer to that category. But there was something different about this man.
Thank you.
So here's this guy, and he's out there, and he's a ruler of the synagogue with a big need.
Jesus wasn't fitting what the priests and rulers wanted the Messiah to be. That's what they had told. The Messiah is going to come, and he's going to deliver us from the Romans, and Jesus wasn't fitting into that mode. In fact, right before the story, we have the feeding of the 5,000, and while they did that, in the book of John, it said that they wanted to take Jesus by force and make him king. It was, the disciples were telling the people, well, it's only because he's so humble that he won't allow himself. And the people decided they were going to take Jesus by force. If you had a ruler that could raise the dead, feed the hungry with nothing, and heal everybody, your army would go out and would be invincible. Think about that. You wouldn't have to have a supply chain. We're not on broadcasting, so you can talk from where you're at.
Oh, okay.
So you have that ability. I didn't make that clear, but
There aren't any, but it's because we're not being broadcast. Just speak up, and everybody will hopefully hear you.
So, there were a lot of people that missed believing in the Messiah when he came because they had this whole concept, societal concept about how the Messiah was going to come and destroy the Romans. Even though nowhere in the Bible or in their scripture did it say the Messiah was going to come and destroy the Romans and make us number one.
Right.
So, we have to look out for that today.
can that happen to us? Can we get a misconception?
This is second advent.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be, if we don't really watch what we're, the scripture, and get to know the scripture, there are going to be many even among us who won't believe, they're going to believe the satanic delusions.
And there'll be plenty of them.
And there'll be plenty of them over the real advent of the Messiah. And so the same thing is going to happen again.
It doesn't fit into what people have been taught, so they, we're looking for something else now.
Before,
And in this, that's exactly what they had. You know, when we know that when Jesus comes, he's going to be coming in the clouds and all the angels with him. And whereas the general belief of people is there's going to be a secret rapture.
Right, and there are going to be events surrounding Jesus' return that unless we know and study, we're not going to recognize the real events. We'll be caught up in the delusional.
We can do that, and the same
And
thing happened there. And because it didn't fit in, the priests and rulers and the leaders of the synagogues didn't believe in Jesus.
And many people lost their life over that.
So you have Jairus. He should be one of the enemies of Jesus, is because he was leader of the synagogue. And generally speaking, the rules. Are we on the internet again? We're
Okay.
on. So we're.
So the other thing with this is we've got to watch getting sidetracked by the multitude of conspiracy theories that are out there.
Yes.
Because the multitude of conspiracy theories that are out here can lead us astray. And so it's very important for us.
I don't think it's hitting up there.
Yeah, it's very important for us to study
There we
and
come.
know what is going to happen, and not get sidetracked on all this stuff that's meant to sidetrack us.
There's plenty of that too. Well, what I want to say is we shouldn't rest on our laurels and say, well, I went to Adventist schools all my life. I've studied all this. I know it. Guess
Anyway,
what?
We
No,
come
wait.
down to
We need to still study. Don't think you've got it.
We've only got just a few
Keep-
minutes
I
here. We're
know.
almost at the
This
end.
is really important. We can't stop studying. We mustn't. Now you can talk.
Okay. But Jairus, he put that aside. He put his enmity against Jesus. We have 10 minutes left. So
He was
Um,
desperate.
his daughter was dying.
He was desperate. I hope that anybody here that's a parent would be just as desperate if your child was dying. So what does he do?
He
There's
comes
one
to
place
Jesus,
where
and it
he's
says,
got hope.
he comes to Jesus and falls at his feet and says, "Come, my daughter is at the point of death. Come and heal her." It's, and Jesus goes. He goes with him. But there's a huge crowd. Everybody wants to touch Jesus too.
And it slows him
They
down.
have everybody, not just some of them, but everybody. As Jesus going through, and you've seen probably some pictures of some campaign event or something where some political candidate is going through crowds, and it takes them a long time to get everybody, because everybody wants, "Oh, would you pray for me? Oh, will you be with me? Can you heal my baby?" And this is what you got as Jesus going. And it's slow going.
Yeah.
Jairus, I'm sure, is like, "My daughter's dying." You know, he's probably in a
Hurry.
tizzy,
Hurry.
you know, of that. And so what ends up happening? All of a sudden, Jesus stops and says, "Who touched me?" In Mark, it says the disciples are going, "What? You've got this whole group of people. Everybody's trying to grab you.
And you
said,
asked
'Who
that?'"
touched me?" In Luke, it says it was Peter was the one that did that. Now, in the book of Mark, he's not going to have that, because Mark is the account of Peter, and he's not going to tell some of the, that was me. Probably it was
Red face.
with a red face, embarrassed because of what he did. But he said, "This crowd is out here, and everybody's trying to touch you, and you said, 'Who touched me?'"
And
But he said,
"But I
"Someone
felt
touched me."
power."
Because power has gone out from me. What had ended up happening is a lady who had been bleeding for 12 years, She crawled up and she says, if I can just touch the hem of his robe, I'll be healed.
And she was.
And then she figured that she could just escape without notice.
And she didn't.
When Jesus works in our lives and does a miracle, he wants us to give what? God credit and praise the Lord. This lady thought, I could just touch this and I'll go out. Nobody will know the difference.
Healed, and
I'll be healed.
And I won't cause a scene.
But I think that Jesus wants us to give him credit, praise him, and thank him for the things that he does.
Like the 10 lepers.
Was there not 10, Lens? Where are the 9?
So she got this healing, and this guy is just beside himself with
who touched me?
fear.
And she's looking through the crowd, and she finally realized, I'm not going to be able to get away with
and
this.
the guy is so antsy. It's like, come on.
Meanwhile,
come on.
Jairus is like, gotta get to my...
And sure enough, somebody comes and...
But she tells the story. She had been bleeding for 12 years. She had wasted all of her money on going to doctors. Is there anything wrong with doctors? No.
No.
In their day, we don't know all of the different things of what doctors were entailing, what they did. They took all her money and she didn't have any, she was worse off than what she was before and she didn't have any money. And so bleeding for 12 years made her unclean. She couldn't go to the synagogue. She couldn't go to the temple. She was unclean. She couldn't get married.
She couldn't have
She was
kids.
unclean. Couldn't have kids. She was unclean. And now she was healed. And she tells that story. It's interesting that it was 12 years because how old was Jairus' daughter? 12 years old. Meanwhile, when this is done and Jesus tells, and then he's turning and he's going to go on to Jairus' house, somebody comes from the house and said, don't bother the master, your daughter died. Your daughter died. So what does Jesus do?
Jesus didn't let that be the end of it. That's the thing. The guy's heart just dropped all the way down to his feet.
You got to notice that Jesus is there, but now that my daughter's dead.
What good is it? But Jesus said, don't give up. Let's go.
I'm going to get here to the part on here.
I know you want to find it, but
Anyways, we'll not look at where I'm
So
not
he
seeing it
gets
where
there.
this is.
and the hired mourners are already there mourning. They were probably kind of called in ahead of time.
We've been in Mark chapter 5, so this is where this is at.
Yeah.
Mark chapter 5.
So here he is, and he says, shh. And then he says, she's not dead, she's just sleeping.
And something else that he said.
And they laughed him to scorn because they knew better.
Jesus heard when the guy came and told Jairus that your daughter's dead, don't trouble the master. And he said
This is important.
something interesting. Do not be afraid, only believe. Only believe.
Mm-hmm.
He permitted no one to go with him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. He came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue and saw a tumult. They had all the hired people. They had already probably hired, my daughter's dead, is going to be dead, and we have to hire people to mourn. They still do that in some countries today. You'll see that. You have, the wealthier you are, the more mourning you have because you've hired more people. And that shows you that the grief that you have. And these people are all mourning and yelling and weeping. And he says, why make this commotion and weep? The child's not dead, but is sleeping. And they ridiculed him and said, the guy's a nut. She's dead. And he's saying that she's sleeping.
He's in denial.
But when he had put them all outside, he took the father, mother of the child, and those who were with him, Peter, James, and John, and entered where the child was. Then he took the child by the hand and said to her, and it says in here, Talitha Kumi, which translated mean, little girl, I say to you, arise. And in the translation of the thing, what it really would be, and this would be a term of endearment, little lamb, arise. Kind of a neat way of putting it, isn't it? Little lamb. We ever think of our kids as like little lambs? We use that term sometimes. Immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years old. And they were overcome with great amazement. But Jesus didn't just go and leave at that moment. He's thinking about this little girl who had been sick. And so what does he do? Make sure that you give her something to eat. She'd been sick for a few days. Probably could have been sick for a week or more. Who knows? She was at the point of death now for a while. And Jesus heals her. And so what is it? Give her something to eat. She hasn't eaten for a while. He doesn't just vanish. The other thing, I remember this from a thing I said, and I believe it. Knowing Jesus the way I do and reading the stories, did Jesus have a big fanfare as he went out the door and he said, see, I told you? We're almost up here. We're up, in fact. I've got 2 minutes left, but we're almost up.
We gotta go. So, go.
I think Jesus went out the back door and disappeared. That's my thought. I don't think Jesus came out and made a big fanfare. See, I was right. You were wrong. He didn't do that. I think he went out the back door. Left it. Okay.
All right. We're going to end now with prayer. And our Father, thank you for these stories. Thank you for the miracles you did back then. And thank you for the miracles you're doing right now. Some of them are in our hearts. Some of them are in our bodies. And some of them are in other things. But you're there in all these things. And we have no idea of a lot of the miracles that you are doing here in our lives, here in our town, in our little church. Miracles you're doing for us. Keep on doing those miracles, Father. We're praying for people to see you or to see you more clearly, and we ask that those prayers be answered. We're praying for people for healing. We pray that you answer those prayers. We're praying that you reach out and touch. And when we pray for that, we need to be opening ourselves up so that we will be willing to reach out our hands in your stead, because your hands aren't here now. Help us when we pray to be willing to be the one that reaches out. And help us to walk from here and during this coming week, to walk with you, to hear your voice, to be your hands and feet. In Jesus' name, amen.